So, my name is Tim Karr. I am the Senior Director of Strategy with Free Press. I've been coming to Freedom to Connect for many years now, and it's great to be back with you all. We have a pretty interesting challenge as we celebrate this win for net neutrality. David, in all of his wisdom, gave me the task of moderating a panel with 10 people on it. And what I've decided to do, thanks to advice from Josh Breitbart and Hannah Sassman, is do a facilitated fishbowl. Now, for those of you who don't know what a facilitated fishbowl is, it's basically a way to organize a panel that has 10 people on it. But what we're going to be doing, we have 10 speakers, but we only have 3 seats. And we're going to be starting with 3 speakers, and then after 10 minutes, somebody's going to tap in. It's kind of like the World Wrestling Federation, except for the fact that we love one another. And then after another 10 minutes, depending on where the conversation is going, the other speakers are all seated here in the front row. I'll ask someone if they want to tap in and join the conversation. It may be an issue that one of you are passionate about and you want to chime in, and you'll tap in and somebody will tap out. And I will be tapping out the person who's been up here the longest. So don't feel offended if you're asked to leave the stage. It's just a part of the process. And I want to get started because the clock has begun. I'm going to start with Michal Rosenn from Kickstarter, Matt Wood, who's my colleague at Free Press, and Kevin, who's with Popular Resistance. Kevin, join us. Great. Excellent. So these are some of the people, some of the 4 million, including our president, who were very instrumental in making this win happen. And I want to just get the conversation started. And this was purposeful. We have someone who represents the business world. Michal's with Kickstarter. Someone who represents the legal world. Matt is our policy director at Free Press. And Kevin, working with Margaret, who's also another one of our speakers, has been very engaged in a lot of the popular activism, in particular the street protests that were a part of this. And I want to open this up by just asking a fairly simple question. And we'll start with you, Michal. If you had, someone had told you a year ago that on this day we would have strong, real net neutrality rules under Title II, what would you have said to them?
I probably would have had a blank look on my face because I didn't know very much about net neutrality a year ago. I mean, our involvement started in April when Ari Shaddadi from Tumblr brought us all into Tumblr's offices to speak with Marvin Amori and to sort of discuss how the fight for net neutrality would kind of continue going forward and get started back up, rather, going forward. And that was our first introduction for a lot of us to the nuances of net neutrality and the net neutrality fight. So we kind of joined this existing world with all these people who've been fighting for years for these things. And I think at that point, 6 months later, until very recently, all of us would have kind of laughed sadly about the prospect of us winning. We did not think we'd be celebrating on Thursday the way that we were, and it's really a testament to the power of everyone, the public and all the public interest organizations and everyone who's been involved to see how far we've come since then. Yeah.
Thanks.
So Tim Tabney is from the legal world, so I'll fight the question a little bit. My experience a year ago around this time was people telling us that we wouldn't get it. That's right. So it wasn't so much, hey, do you think this is possible? There were people saying, this is impossible. You should give it up. You should stop. And I think the last year is really a testament that everybody up here in the last hour or so has spoken to, of people really working for what they feel like they need and want to win rather than giving up before they start. I think we're going to hear a lot about what do we learn from this, just like we heard a lot about what do we learn from SOPA. And those comparisons only go so far. The analogies are always a little bit barren at the end of the day, but I think what we learn in both cases is when you're told it's impossible in Washington, you have lots of choices, but 2 big ones: give up or keep trying anyway. And we kept trying, and what do you know? We helped to shift and shape the conversation thanks to no one individual or one group, but millions of people, quite literally, and many of the people who've been in this room and doing it for far longer than I've been.
Well, when that happened, I was busy fighting the Trans-Pacific Partnership and seeking real health care reform, not Obamacare, but single payer, and seeking, to deal with the inequality issues. And so I wasn't paying all that much attention. I did read the Rosenn decision, and I thought it was kind of shocking that the court threw out net neutrality, but I thought there was enough support for net neutrality that it wouldn't happen. Then we got a call, Margaret and I got a call from Evan Greer of Fight for the Future, and he said, we need somebody to occupy the FCC. because they were trying to destroy net neutrality and create this tiered internet. And that's when we started to pay attention, because the idea of a tiered internet really was exactly the opposite we thought we needed. You don't want to lose another space to inequality. And so the tiered internet really turned us off. When I heard, as you did, I heard that it's an impossible thing to fight, and we can't win, it's not on the political table. That attracted me even more to it. When I hear that the corrupt government and the corporatists who control it make something politically impossible, that's when I want to do it. And so Margaret Flowers and I went to the FCC for a protest, and as soon as we were getting out of our car to go to the protest, we got a call from Gigi Sohn while we're in the parking lot. What are you guys doing going to a protest at the FCC? And so we had a little conversation with her, and then at the protest we announced we're going to sleep out and start an encampment. We spent the first night by ourselves out there, the two of us, wondering, are we crazy? What are we doing? we had it with Occupy. We were tired of Occupy. We didn't want to Occupy again. And then I became convinced we were going to win during the encampment, because Tom Wheeler came down to talk with us. He was the third commissioner. We had a majority of the commissioners come down to the encampment to talk to us. And Tom and I and Margaret discussed the idea of, can you get net neutrality without Title II? He thought that the Verizon decision led a path without Title II. We thought that was crazy, and we told him that we're insisting on Title II, and that's where we're going. And the really good news, as Gigi says, is Commissioner Wheeler listened. And when he announced his tiered internet plan, he also asked for comments on net neutrality and Title II. And that opened the door to the movement, and the movement went through it.
Thanks, Kevin. So, that Malcolm Gladwell has this somewhat hackneyed analogy by now about the tipping point. But I think there are elements of truth to it. It's not, and his analogy is that, well, yes, there are tipping points, but there are a million points of pressure that lead up. And I'm wondering, any of you, whether you felt over this year, or, this is an issue that we've been working on for 10 years, or maybe even over the last 10 to 13 years, according to Tim, the other Sir Tim. Was there a moment when you realized that the calculus had changed and we were definitely going to win? Does anybody want to go first on that?
I mean, I don't know. I think it really was a series of events, and each one kind of made it more real in a lot of ways. So yeah, I mean, November was big, and to have the president say this is what we should do, nobody should mistake that was a big deal. However, a lot of work remained to be done at the FCC. It was hardly a done deal at that time. If people followed the chronology, at that time we were talking about different models and using Title II for some things and not for others. So I don't know, I guess the people who think that was the decisive moment, I would never deny that it was a huge political moment, but there was a ton of organizing left to be done, a ton of legal work left to be done at the FCC, and that's really what happened over the last 3 months. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was just more of a series of events that started really with that release that Kevin and Margaret and others were protesting on the ground, and lots of people were protesting online back in April when people said, oh, it really is this bad. I mean, people could fight about what was allowed under the vestiges of authority left under the court case, but basically we looked at that and it said substantial room for discrimination. And we said that doesn't sound like net neutrality to us or what we've described as net neutrality. So, I mean, I think that was a tipping point. I think there were lots that sort of led to where we are now, and we're not done. That's the thing, is like we have to keep going, as Gigi said and others said, so it's hardly like this is over.
One of the problems we always see in every issue we work on a ton of issues on popular resistance because we cover all the fronts of struggle. If you ever want to see what the movement's doing that the media is not reporting, check out popularresistance.org and sign up for our daily digest. But one of the constant problems in any advocacy movement that's trying to really make significant changes, you never know how close you are. You can't see it. And often when the other side is losing, they stiffen their backs and look like they're being stronger when there's a lot of debate and insecurity inside the room that we don't see. Chris Hedges, who's a good friend of ours and someone who's a strong ally, a writer you may know of, he says that he was in East Germany talking to East German advocates for taking down the wall. They said to him that maybe in a year we'll be able to cross back and forth through the wall, normally. And that week, the wall came down. So the people most involved didn't know how close they were. I think that was true in our struggle, too. I saw people, even just a few weeks before President Obama spoke up, who were giving up, who were working on a hybrid plan, who were putting out different perspectives we're not entitled to, trying to figure out a way to do the best they can in a bad situation. And others of us, like Margaret, Evan, and me, decided we need to escalate. When we feel like that's happening, we need to escalate and say, we're not going away, we're not compromising, we're going to stick with our position. And that's when we did some protests outside the White House. That's when we blockaded the chairman's home driveway and forced him to take a common carrier to work. He did take the metro, and there was no discrimination on the metro. He was able to go. So I think one of the key lessons of this is be clear about what you want and don't give up, don't compromise. And I think if you have that as your attitude, you never know how close you are, and you might actually be very close to winning. And I think we were closer than many people realized, even at that late date.
Great. Before you start, Michal, I'm gonna tap Matt out, and I think does anybody want to jump in at this point? Other than I can volunteer one of you. Evan, do you want to join us? All right. Evan Greer, everybody, fight for the future. Go ahead.
I was just going to echo a lot of what Kevin and Matt said, that, even a few weeks ago when that New York Times breaking news alert, everyone got on their phone probably saying that, the FCC is likely to back Title II. I think even at that point, we knew that the fight wasn't over and that there were still interconnection issues that we wanted to make sure are addressed in the rule and, sender side issues that we're still concerned about. So the fight definitely continued even as the kind of signs of victory continued to mount. And I think even now we are aware that certain members of Congress are looking to pass legislation that might compromise everything that we've accomplished. And so I think we very much are aware that the fight has been active until the end and continues even past the end.
Great. Evan, did you want to answer that question about tipping point, a moment where you knew we were going to win?
For me, there was a bunch of moments along the way when I felt either like elation or despair. And I distinctly remember sitting in Hannah Sassman's kitchen talking about, and basically going through this thing where we both kind of agreed, we're kind of screwed, but let's keep trying. But for me, the moment when I really realized that there was no chance that we could lose this overall fight for the internet in the long haul was when we hooked up this funny thing to battleforthenet.com, which was our kind of hub site that we used to drive comments and calls on this. And what we did is, during one of our big call drives, we added my cell phone number to the call chain. So after someone had called 10 members of Congress, they would get connected to me, and I would say thank you to them. It was supremely disruptive to my workday and rather frustrating. But I talked to literally probably 100 people who had all called 10 members of Congress. I admit that I have probably never called 2 members of Congress in my life. It's one of my least favorite things to do. And so these are people who were diehards, who were so committed to net neutrality that they took a whole bunch of time to call, and they were literally everyone. I talked to extremely religious right-wing grandmas and punk rockers from California and a hip-hop artist from the Bronx and construction worker and farmers. And I mean, it was just everyone. There was no way to say, these type of people care about net neutrality. And that was the moment when I was like, you know what? They can throw all the misinformation they want out there. They can throw all the money they want at trying to spread lies and convince people, of the disaster scenarios and stuff. But in the end, people want a free and open internet, and they're gonna fight for it. And as soon as they get a whiff that someone's trying to take it for them, they're gonna be right there. And just knowing that there was such a broad spectrum of people that cared gave me this sense that, no matter what they throw at us, we'll always come back stronger than they thought was possible.
So Evan and Fight for the Future were really instrumental in building the online presence. Demand Progress, Free Press, many others built a lot of useful tools online, but we were working together under Battle for the Net. Kevin, you were really instrumental in taking what by and large had been organizing in the digital realm into real street protests. And you had mentioned earlier about camping out on the front lawn in the driveway of Chairman Wheeler. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work you do and your what we like to call in the advocacy realm, your theory of change and why this sort of in-person protest
that's a much longer answer than I have time for. That's a lecture, actually. But I guess I would say in a brief kind of format, first off, we do a lot more than street protest and direct action. That's just, if at 100% of things we do, that's about 4%. So even though we're known for that, especially in this movement, that's really a small part of what we do. We do a lot of writing to educate people. We do a lot of online organizing as well. But we do think that direct action is a very important piece of the puzzle. And I suspect if we hadn't, I think maybe the most important decision we made was to go out and do an encampment a week before the rulemaking began, because that week, that encampment got a lot of people excited. It became more than just a tech people's issue, it became a people's issue. And people could see that, this is serious enough that someone's sleeping outside the FCC. And, within a week we had 20 tents and a bunch of people, so Margaret and I weren't out there alone at all, which was nice. And, but I think doing that week before the rulemaking, because when you called and we talked about this, you said there was a big plan for a protest the day of the rulemaking announcement. And our initial reaction was, that's too late. We got to do it before that. And we had a lot of discussion about when and where and how, and we decided that we had to do it as soon as we could, which at that point we could do it about 8 days before the rulemaking. I think that, we see a corrupt political table in Washington, and we got to reset it. And so that's a process of resetting. We understand that by occupying public space, you often occupy part of the public dialogue. And that gave us a chance to start to get our own narrative out there. And that, I think that first week was absolutely critical. Our theory of change is that you have to envision the change you want to see. So in the middle of July, we did a protest outside the FCC which was a musical, a 3-part musical called Which Side Are You On, Tom? And the main song was Which Side Are You On, Tom? Which side are you on? Are you with the people or with the telecoms? And the protest included a tug of war between the people and the fat cats. I was a fat cat, Comcast. Margaret was an angel whispering in Tom Wheeler's ear. We had a devil whispering in his ear. We had people pulling it, and they had a tug of war. And as more people joined the tug of war, gradually the people started to win, and Tom Wheeler's final verse of the song was, I know which side I'm on, I'm with the people and not the telecoms. We want to envision Tom Wheeler coming to our side because the people demanded it. And of course then the people pulled, Tom joined, and the Comcast and all, we all fell down on the ground, and the people won. Power to the people. And so I think that was a key point, to envision what we want to see. So that's a key part of, I think, change, is to have a vision for where you want to go and convince people they have the power to do it. And I think that we're so disempowered in this country to feel we have no ability to change anything. It's an oligarchy, it's corrupt, the money controls everything. But the people have a lot more power than we realize. You saw it, we've seen it before on the internet. There's some major victories. We worked also on TPP together, Stop Fast Track a year ago. We're in the process of stopping it now. Check out online the Ron Wyden toast-in. We're having a toast-in at Ron Wyden's office as we speak, where we're saying Ron Wyden's career is toast if he supports fast-track trade authority. So the people are rising, and we're seeing it in all sorts of different ways. So I think people power needs to be recognized as an ingredient. I'm not saying that direct action we did was the only thing that won it, but I think it was a key part. There was so much more that happened. People did such a great job. What's great about this coalition was it really pulled together lots of different skills, lots of different backgrounds, lots of different techniques. We all agreed on the goal, and we used our own tactics to fit in with the strategic plan. It was a really good coalition.
Great. I have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that for a second. I think what's so remarkable about how this got done is how unusual it is that this kind of coalition wins against such powerful entrenched voices like the telecoms. The Gawker post that someone mentioned earlier, I actually got into like my first Twitter fight this weekend with Alex Perrine, because I called him out and I was like, it's just wrong. Like, you're actually just factually wrong. These companies did not at all push for Title II. And Eric Schmidt, the Wall Street Journal reported that Eric Schmidt called the White House to lobby against Title II. And I think that's what's the most remarkable thing about this, is that usually we think in order to achieve something against companies like Comcast and like AT&T, who have hundreds and hundreds of telecom lawyers and lobbyists in DC, whose job it is to get Washington to do what they want. The fact that we were able to fight against that successfully without an oligarchy behind us is pretty remarkable.
Thanks. I'm gonna tap Kevin out. Thank you, Kevin. You'll get a chance to come back. And ask Rashad Robinson of Color of Change to join us. Hi, Rashad. Thanks, Kevin. Michal, I have a question for you. There have been stories in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times that have portrayed an April meeting in the Flatiron District. I guess we're in the middle of the Flatiron District here, amongst Kickstarter, Etsy, Tumblr, some of the New York-based tech startups. They portrayed that as the flashpoint for the net neutrality movement. Do you think that reporting is true? I imagine you were there.
Yeah, that was the meeting I mentioned earlier,
Yes.
where with Marvin Amori.
Yeah.
I think it's incorrect to label that as a flashpoint. I think, for me personally, it was a flashpoint because that's the point at which I got involved, and that's the point at which, as you mentioned, a lot of other companies like Meetup and Etsy got involved along with Tumblr in the fight. So it was certainly a flashpoint to get the kind of specifically the New York tech startup community in the fight. I have no illusion that we were the reason that this happened. We were one of the players among many, and to the extent that we could represent the voice of small businesses, to the extent that we could represent the voices of our users, creators on Kickstarter who are trying to create their projects, sellers on Etsy who are trying to create their small businesses. I think that was probably pretty powerful, and I know that when we organized Marvin and Engine, Julie Samuels from Engine organized a trip for all of us to go down to DC, and it was like a lobbying trip where we went and talked to congresspeople and senators, and it was remarkable how many of them said, we never hear voices like yours. We hear from AT&T and Comcast all the time. Netflix came in, maybe, but smaller companies, people who represent small businesses and users around the country, we never hear from you. And you're like, yeah, I'm the only lawyer at Kickstarter. The Meetup's lawyer is the only lawyer there, so we don't have the opportunity to do so. But this is something that we saw as extremely important. And so, I think the newspapers probably were overplaying it in terms of the larger fight, but in getting the tech community involved, it was
Thank you.
instrumental.
So Rashad, the other story that perhaps hasn't been told enough is the work of the civil rights community, both I would consider sort of a younger generation and the old guard, both for and against net neutrality. I know you have been at the center of that fight with a few others. Can you speak to a little about that process and how you worked through that to get to this one?
Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you all. Color of Change, we were founded 10 years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina with a single email from our founders, James Rucker and Van Jones, with this idea that the civil rights community lacked an engine, an organization that could quickly capture moments and channel people's anger and frustration and hold government and institutions accountable to the needs and concerns of Black folks. And so being a next generation civil rights organization that uses technology, we understand that, our battles, whether it was against Glenn Beck or against Alec, would not have been strong or powerful had we not had an open internet, had an open internet not been there for us. And as someone who was on the ground as the tanks rolled in Ferguson and seeing a new generation, even younger generation of civil rights advocates be able to use technology to be heard and counted and visible, this is one of those civil rights moments of our generation, one of those structural changes like the Voting Rights Act and so many other structural policies that allow us to get at the other policies and the other goals that ensure equity and equality in our country. And so we've been invested in this since that compromise moment that we had 4 or 5 years ago, and over time have been engaged. The first battle I was involved with as executive director of Color of Change was actually the AT&T T-Mobile merger, and really talking about how those type of mergers impact Black communities and hurt Black consumers. And so being able to leverage the power and narrative of civil rights and of underrepresented constituencies in DC and at a place like the FCC, which is set up to do that, but so many of the voices they've been hearing for so many years were voices of major civil rights organizations telling them a different story. And the work of organizations like Center for Media Justice, National Hispanic Media Coalition, Presente, and my organization Color of Change, Free Press, and many others to help sort of redefine this moment, to elevate new voices in this conversation, to do the type of work around ensuring that we had Hill visits with some of the young people from the Black Lives Matter movement and others, to redefine this conversation, to talk about what was at stake for the future of organizing, for the future of our economy, I think is unfortunately actually one of the untold stories of this victory. And as progressives who want to win more of these fights in a country that is increasingly diversifying, we need to make sure that we hold up this story, because this is one of the key elements to winning on so many other things that we care about. It's how we turn the cultural presence on issues we care about into the cultural presence, the cultural power to win.
Thanks. Evan, I don't know really how to characterize Fight for the Future, but I would say one thing is probably true is that you really speak for digital natives. It feels like your audience skews slightly younger than some of the other groups that have been involved. And I know that you have a pretty good analogy about, someone who's a digital native who's very close to you, who realized that that we were going to win and that this was a real issue. I was wondering whether you cared to share that story.
Sure,
It was so great.
I will. And really quickly, I just want to echo about these civil rights groups not getting credit in this. And I just want to say, the media wants to tell the story that John Oliver made a video and then President Obama made an endorsement and then there was net neutrality. Or if we're lucky, they want to tell the story that a bunch of primarily white-led tech groups won this fight. And that's all BS, as hopefully everyone in this room knows. They want to tell that story for a reason, because they want to support the status quo. So let's forget what they have to say and say what we have to say, and thank you. So quickly, I have a 4-year-old, shocker, for all of you looking at my nail polish. We were kind of kicking around all these different ideas around the internet slowdown protest, which we were beginning to organize, and we knew we needed another huge moment like SOPA, something where the whole web just came together and rose up and made it so clear that this isn't a political issue, this is just a freedom issue that we all care about. And we were kind of like, well, what's the meme? What's the single thing that anyone can understand? Lots of people had already been using kind of the slow loading symbol as something, but we weren't sure if that was the way to go. And I I was doing a lot of work one day, and my partner was out and about, and so the iPad and the Netflix came into play to keep my kid occupied while I was working. And he got super frustrated with the loading symbol, and he was asking me about it, and I kind of like explained a little bit of the whole deal to him in the explain it like I'm 5 thing, even though he's 4. A couple days later, I just hear from the other room, Comcast! That was him shaking his little tiny fist at the screen and like totally understanding this is like the symbol of modern frustration. And so we felt like, well, that's the proof that this is the way to kind of just help everyone understand and just capture people's frustration with people slowing down their internet to make more money. And that's something no one wants, and that was a way that we were able to just capitalize on people's basic understanding of just, we love the internet and we want it to keep working.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to tap someone new in. Thank you, Michal. Yes. Sarah, will you join us? Sarah Morris with New America's Open Technology Institute. So, Evan, I just want to continue on one thing, because you mentioned PIPA and SOPA. Others have mentioned PIPA and SOPA. I know that Fight for the Future and demand. Is David Segal here, by the way? Oh, I'm sorry, David. I didn't realize you were there. Okay. I know that Fight for the Future was involved in the PIPA-SOPA battle, and a lot of people have said that was, sort of a watershed moment in online organizing. You were also involved in the net neutrality win. What similarities do you see, and what differences between those two important organizing efforts?
I saw someone online call SOPA PIPA a flash mob as compared to what the net neutrality fight was. And I think that's a little bit astute. I mean, it absolutely was a huge moment, but it was sort of a moment. In some ways a singular moment. I mean, and there was a lot that went into that initial protest, and that's something that not a lot of people know. People, it's sort of like there was suddenly a blackout one day. And that's not totally true. I mean, Fight for the Future organized American Censorship Day, a couple weeks before the SOPA blackout, which sort of like sparked the idea of like, oh, websites can protest. And we weren't the only ones. We worked with Demand Progress, I believe, and many other groups. I'm out of my league here because I was still a professional musician when this all happened and didn't know the first thing about internet policy. I think that, certainly, obviously, one thing people point to is the role of giant companies like Google. And I think it's absolutely not true that SOPA PIPA was won because of them, but I think it's even sweeter that we can point to this victory and say, unquestionably, this was a people's victory. We didn't have the biggest websites in the world, kind of driving tons of traffic. We had each other. We had small companies that had a vested interest in supporting their users, and we had really smart tactics and people that were willing to put their bodies on the line, like Kevin and Margaret going and sleeping out in front of the FCC. This was a long haul fight, and it didn't start a year ago either. I mean, Free Press and many other groups, Color of Change, many other groups were working on this for a decade, leading up to this. This is something that a lot of groundwork went into, and so it's not just a single moment or something that can't be recreated. I think SOPA and then this is proof that the internet has completely changed what is or isn't possible. And I would implore, because I remember also when we started talking about Occupy the FCC, I can't tell you how many groups kind of told me, I don't know if this is a good idea, Evan, this seems a little extreme, or blah, 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 blah. We should take the word impossible out of our vocabularies. Nothing is impossible anymore, and we proved that last week. We proved it on SOPA, and we'll prove it again with the TPP, with the other issues that we care about. And so take that word out of your vocabularies, folks. Whether you're a DC advocacy group or you work for a member of Congress, nothing is impossible, and we're going to prove it again, and that's what I think this net neutrality fight means.
Great, thank you. This is a question for both. Thank you. Question for both Sarah and Rashad. And I know, Sarah, I'll start with you. I imagine that as someone who works in the policy realm in Washington, this is a question that you sometimes dread, sometimes like. But it's the big question. And it's a question I think a lot of people have been asking. And obviously the net neutrality battle is not over. But what do you see as what's next on the horizon? What are, Evan, I think, very clearly demonstrated how we can organize effectively around this, as has Rashad. We have the power of the internet public. We are a political constituency that can apply are forced to other issues and related issues. What do you see as the kind of big points on the horizon related to net neutrality and other issues?
So I do want to just echo a little bit of what Evan said. You know, we think about SOPA PIPA as a moment. I think it was one moment that was preceded by other moments. AT&T T-Mobile merger, the LPFM fight, lots of important battles. And you know, at OTI we build networks, also physical networks for connectivity, wireless networks. And one of the benefits of these community-led commotion networks is the name of it, is that by involving the community and building buy-in from the stakeholders in that process, you create a network that you can then leverage from there on out. And I think that that's what's happened here. We have these moments that in isolation, when we look back, are moments, but I think what we've really seen now culminating in this fight is a movement. And so I think it will be really important in the coming months and years to think about how we harness this political energy in a way that leverages all of the work and the really diverse stakeholders. I mean, we are talking about industry, we are talking about grassroots organizing, civil rights groups, and really figuring out how to continue to grow and build the movement and to use it on other issues going forward. So to answer your question, I think next on the horizon, we still have a lot of work to do. I mean, it's really fun as an advocate to be able to sit up on a stage and really embrace an utter policy win. Like everything that was on the table, we put things on the table like interconnection, mobile parity, like things that were completely off the table. All of these things were off the table. It wasn't just reclassification that was off the table last year. It was all of it. And so, or at least in the way the NPRM was framed. And so to shift the debate full circle, I think deserves a lot of celebration. But we still have a lot to do to protect the rules, to make sure that we win the inevitable court challenges, and to make sure that you know, we're not ending up with bad outcomes in Congress. You know, there's a big merger on the table as well that I think is relevant in this debate and relative in its own right for people's ability to communicate and have choice in their providers. And the Muni network fight is not over. We have, you know, preemption of two, really important and another groundbreaking action on the part of the commission. But we've got bans in, depending on how you count it, 20 to 25 other states across the country, or restrictions, and really figuring out how to leverage those communities and help them take advantage of the path that's been paved for them by Chattanooga and Wilson. So those are sort of the big ones. I think that there's still a lot to be done in Universal Service Fund. We've done E-rate now, but I think that the chairman has signaled that there may be others on other parts of the fund on the table. So lots to keep us busy.
Thank you, Rashad.
So yeah, and you know, it was a pleasure to stand with this, you know, wide range of, you know, diverse organizations, especially from, you know, the industry leaders and the other civil rights organizations that I've mentioned. But Silicon Valley has some real work to do around their diversity. And I'd be amiss as a civil rights leader to sit here and to like gloss over that. That became a huge talking point that we had to battle down every single day. The big telecom companies do have a history, a union history, even if they fought the unions and have been horrible to them, but a history of generations of hiring from diverse communities. And you know, as we've even moved into our work at pushing Silicon Valley and leading some campaigns around even diversity data, seeing some of the diversity data that's come out with 2 or 3 or 4% African American or Latino staff, where they've actually counted janitorial staff and cafeteria workers in those percentages, and to hear that this is an issue around STEM education when they have marketing jobs and all sorts of other jobs. And so my conversation is we can win here together, but the future of who gets to participate in this economy is a structural one, but it's also a one around diversity and opening up doors. And so from my perspective, you know, as we look at sort of like how we deal with these issues ahead, we've worked together, but I want to be really clear that even in the continued fights to protect net neutrality, the dismal record on diversity that many of the Silicon Valley companies have will continue to be an Achilles heel for this movement. And people of all backgrounds and all races really need to stand and push on that. Another issue as it comes to this sort of technology issue and as we're thinking about is the issues around big data and privacy and the civil rights implications, whether it's the heat maps that have been drawn up in cities like Chicago that have predicted who's going to commit crime and having people knock on folks' doors and say, we think you might be up to something, or how financial data has been used to predict who gets jobs or doesn't get jobs or even gets interviews. These are all big questions that if we actually are going to be a coalition, if we actually are going to be people that stand together, and Color of Change and Center for Media Justice and National Hispanic Media Coalition, we put a lot of skin in this game. There are people who might not talk to us anymore. There were times when I was on the ground in places where we took stands on these issues, and folks, we lost some funding. We had some people that don't invite us to events that are incredibly important for our visibility as an organization. We are a 10-year-old next generation organization, and we went up against 100-year-old organizations in our movement. And so the question is what's the skin in the game for folks in this room to stand with us on many of these technological issues that impact the future of our community? We stood on this because it was the right thing to do, and my push to all of you in this room is to stand with us on some of these other issues because it's the right thing to do.
Hear, hear. Keep that microphone. I have a question. Speaking of diversity, look at us. How do we get more people of color, our black and brown brothers and sisters who fight for, last week, as I mentioned in my opening speech, last week I went to the Ford Foundation where the head of the Ford Foundation said internet rights are civil rights. And I extended that to say internet freedom is our freedom and it's our fight together. And I've asked the people, every activist of color that I know, to come be here in this room with us. And you're here, thank you very much. But how do we become a more diverse Freedom to Connect organization? How do we work together more effectively?
No, I think that's a great question. It's a question I get all the time. I actually just spoke at, recently I spoke at the Environmental Grantmakers Association, and one could imagine I might get that question there as well. My question is not why are not black or brown people here, but where do you show up where black and brown people are leadership? Yes. The question is how do you walk into doors at times when you may be the only one or one of three and sit in spaces that are sometimes where you are the minority? Those will be the moments within those real opportunities and dialogue. Look, I am a paid leader of a national civil rights organization whose office is 10 blocks away. I believe in this issue, but I got in a cab to come down here to speak because that is my job. And I have also been on the ground at these protests around the country, and the question is for all of us in this room is, when do you show up there? That's how you open up the door. Whether it's, and so, I say yes. It would be great to continue to invite people of color into these rooms, but the question is not why people of color are not here, but where do you show up for people of color? Where do you show up in rooms that are diverse? When do you make those attempts? Because those will be the moments in which real dialogue, real connection is built. But I appreciate the sentiment that we want to make these spaces more diverse. But we don't want to just make them more diverse so people can come here and learn about the issues that you all are working on. Diversity is a two-way street, and it's about people in this room putting skin in the game on issues that matter for black folks. And it's not just it's just not the other way around as well. So.
Thank you. Great. So we've reached we're a little over our time. I'm going to ask Margaret to join us, and Evan. Thank you very much again, Evan Greer, Fight for the Future. Margaret Powers, who's been a popular resistant. Margaret, it looked like you wanted to answer the question, what's next? I saw you raising your hand
Yeah,
at that point,
I did.
so I thought maybe I'd give you an opportunity.
Thank you. Because Sarah kind of touched on it, on what we need to do. And in this coalition, we've created what's called a movement of movements, where we had a real diversity of groups that came together, and we used different tactics, but as Kevin said, we were clear on what our goal is, and so it worked. And I'm really happy to hear what you said, Rashad, about not being invited to these groups, because Kevin and I have been involved in advocacy for a long time on a number of issues. And one of the things that's been really frustrating is to see groups that compromise what they want based on wanting to be at the table or wanting to get that particular funding. And that is what has really led us to maintain the status quo. And so I want to say that we're used to not getting the money. We're used to not being invited. Howard Zenn, I think, said it well when he said, what are we supposed to do? Go where you're not supposed to go, say what you're not supposed to say, and stay when they ask you to leave. And if we actually want to create change in this dysfunctional plutocratic system, that's what we need to do. And the more that people join into that and we work together, the more we're going to actually have these wins. And so it was really exciting to see. This was kind of a textbook case of people power, and now we need to use that. We've created this movement of movements, and we need to glean these lessons. Don't compromise, be clear on what you want, and be independent of those groups that have a political agenda that want you to buy into their agenda. And you've got to say no. We're confident. We have to stay on this issue and win it. And so for us, the big thing is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have 2 months to win this. If we can keep fast-track legislation from being introduced in Congress, if we can get to the end of April and it's not introduced, we're good for another 2 years. And this, if you haven't looked up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this is really a game changer for all of the work that we're doing across issues. So I hope that people will jump in on these next 2 months and work on this. Also, our philosophy is not just resistance, but creation of the alternatives. And this was exciting to see that we actually won something positive as opposed to just stopping something really bad. And we have to build on that. And so that's why I'm really excited to see the work on the community networks and on really winning universal access, affordable access that's high quality for everyone. So I think let's capture lessons from this movement and let's keep working together and realize that we have people power.
So Margaret, I stood there somewhat fecklessly, I have to admit, as you and Kevin were being barred from entering the FCC meeting on February 26th. And it's probably because you came in with a banner on more than one occasion. I think the second occasion it got a little physical. And
not on our part.
Not on your part. Yes,
They
I saw the
attacked us.
video. It was not on your part. That is true.
We weren't planning for that.
Can you comment a little bit? I mean, for me, it struck me as highly ironic that the Federal Communications Commission was barring people from communicating at their meeting, although in a somewhat, I think some people would consider unorthodox way. Obviously, you may have a different opinion, but can you comment a little bit on how that all happened? And
Yeah, and let me say that we would use other tools if they worked. If we had a seat at the table and we were actually being listened to, we wouldn't have to resort to these other tactics. But we don't have a seat at that table, and so we have to get our message out in different ways. And so we did, disrupt the FCC meetings nonviolently and peacefully. And our intention that day that we were attacked was just to hold up a banner that said 85% of Republicans support net neutrality. And the security was kind of tired of us by that point, and just pushed us out of the room. So it was kind of bittersweet for us because we actually really wanted to be there on the 26th and be in the audience. And the picture of Chairman Wheeler and Clyburn and Rosenn holding hands, that was really exciting for us to see that moment. But that's just the price that you pay. And it's not the first time for us, And I mean, one of my first direct actions was because I'm a physician and I care about universal health care for all of my patients and actually want our system to be about health and not profits, was a Senate Finance Committee hearing where they only invited industry to testify. And the people that were at the table had spent $3 million to be there. And the voices of the patients and the health professionals was completely left out. And we had to stand up and call that out as not being right. And that's what we have to do. And that's a responsibility, I think, if we really want change, we have to accept that we have to do the right thing, no matter what the consequences are.
Thanks. Sarah, there's an inside-outside strategy that we often deploy in our organizing around this, which is that you combine people who are inside Washington, who have the access, have knowledge, with the grassroots organizing effort. And I would say you're probably more representative of the inside piece of that puzzle. And there was an interesting moment on February 26th when we won. We had a party in a bar in Washington, D.C., and suddenly members of Congress started showing up. Nancy Pelosi was there, Anna Eshoo, Senator Ed Markey, Ellison, Representative Ellison, Keith Ellison, good dancer. And so, there's a saying that, success has 1,000 fathers. And so what's your sense right now that we've kind of captured this moment? It was sort of defeated by the llama drama, which happened on the same day. I noticed how the Twitter feeds all of a sudden focused on these llamas that had gotten loose and not on net neutrality. But there was a moment. And when those moments happen, Washington pays attention. What's your sense of, this is a Congress that is beholden to special interests. These are companies that spend a lot of money in campaign contributions. Do you see anything, this transition happening on the Hill in your experience there?
So, yeah, when I talked about this being a movement, it's certainly a movement in terms of the organizing that happened. This was a really, really compelling, I think this story will continue to be told for a long time because it was this, the way that people worked together, the way that people talked to one another, and the way that we executed all of these different parts of the campaign was really remarkable. But when I talk about the movement, I don't just mean the campaign. There is actually, and others have kind of alluded to this on the panel or said it all right, there is a political force now that is not something that the people on this panel control or created or perpetuate. It exists now out in the world, and it is something that members of Congress, I think, should pay attention to. And the call for an open and unencumbered internet is one that now has lasted for decades, and it is backed up by millions of voices across the country who, as Gigi pointed out, took the time to write their federal agency. My dad wrote the FCC. My dad, he likes technology, but he doesn't like politics, he doesn't like getting in the midst of things. He recognized that this was important and wrote a letter to the FCC. And that kind of power doesn't go away. It doesn't just disintegrate once the particular moment of the fight is over. And so I think that that will continue to resonate in these spaces, in spaces back in communities across the country, and on Capitol Hill.
Thanks. So we have about 2.5 minutes before we sub in a new person. I thought I'd give an opportunity for someone in the audience to ask a question. I know this is a long session, and I'd like to invite some questions. We have one here. Why don't we start? We'll start in the back with David, okay, and then we'll move this way.
So maybe this is a setup.
Sure, borrow mine. I got it.
Maybe this is a setup and maybe it's inappropriate, but can you say what's going on with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and why this group of people should get involved?
Did you come up after me? Sorry, I missed the question.
So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a trade agreement that's been negotiated for more than 5 years by the Obama administration, and it's the first time that they've ever classified the text of the agreement. So our own members of Congress, most of them have not seen what's in it, although large corporations and trade groups have had direct access to that text and have been writing that text for years. We have seen some of it that's been leaked, and what we've seen has been very concerning. So for one thing, we don't know everything that's in it, but we know that what we've seen in terms of giving greater legal standing to corporations to challenge laws that we have to protect our communities, our health and safety through things like the investor-state dispute settlements has been enhanced. The patent protections that they have are really outrageous. Basically, they want to eliminate any barriers to any patenting at all, including animals and plants and human DNA and things like that. Patenting, not allowing a corporation to patent something is seen as a trade barrier. I think for this community in specifically, many of the things that you've been concerned about with SOPA and PIPA, I think will be found inside of this trade agreement. As well as I have concerns about wanting to do municipal broadband, because there's a lot of language in there about anything that's considered a state-owned enterprise that has any sort of state advantage has to be on a level playing field with corporations. They have to be allowed to also submit, bids or whatever, and there's provisions in there to end Buy America. So there's a lot to be concerned about, and what's happening right now is that the president is pushing Congress really hard to give him what's called fast-track trade promotion authority, which would allow the president to sign the agreement. Then Congress gets 30 to 60 days to read the thousands of pages of technical legal language. They get a very restricted debate time, no amendments, and an up or down vote. And so it's really pushing through this very secretive agreement through a secretive, non-democratic process. And so we've been able to hold them off before from granting fast track, but this is like their real big final push because they're close to negotiating the end of the agreement. And so we've got to hold it off for the next 2 months. Our feeling is once we get to May, the concerns are about the next presidential election. There'll be a lot of hesitancy to push through this trade agreement at that point, and we'll be good for a while. But we're putting the focus this week on Ron Wyden, because he's the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, and Orrin Hatch, who's the chair, is pushing him to co-sponsor the fast-track legislation. And Ron is a free trader. He believes in free trade. And so we've got to stop him from doing that, because that will give the other Democrats cover to support it. So it's not free trade, as Kevin said. There are 29 chapters, and maybe 4 or 5 of them are about actual trade issues, and the rest are like a corporate wish list, things that couldn't get through the front door of Congress. So it's a really game changer, and we've got to stop it.
Okay, so we're at the 10-minute mark. Does anybody?
I'll be happy to stop.
Well, actually, no, I think it's me. It's Rashad, I believe, has been up here the longest. I was thinking, Harold, maybe you'd like to come up. Everybody, Harold Feld from Public Knowledge. I'm sure, and David's here, I know, and I'm sure everybody knows Harold. Harold, I might be betraying a confidence here, but I think it's kind of funny. We've been in this fight for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And I can remember back in 2009, 2010, you and I were out to dinner in Washington, and we were at that moment where Janikowski was as close as he was going to come. And you told me we're going to get Title II. And then there was this kind of backpedaling that happened over the summer and into the fall, and December 2010, we got this Title I concoction from Janikowski. What do you think was different about 2010 compared to 2014?
Everything. More seriously, one of the things I want to emphasize is that every single thing that we've accomplished has been by moving the ball forward. This has been a ground game for some of us going back to 1998. And there have been a lot of times when I can remember, particularly after Brand X, which was the Supreme Court case where they said, well, sure, go ahead, classify it as Title I if that's what makes you happy, FCC. And we salvaged, and particularly Michael Copps and Jonathan Adelstein, the Democratic chairs of the Democratic commissioners at the FCC, salvaged this internet policy statement, and everybody dismissed it as crap. And, this was stupid, it didn't get us anything, why were we bothering? And there were a whole series of little tiny steps where we kind of clawed this back and kept the flame alive and kept moving it forward. And at every stage, everybody said that this was crap. But every successive stage built on that. So one of the things that was different in 2014 was we'd had 2010. And we'd had 2010. We saw what hadn't worked. We had we learned a lot about the necessary engagement with the civil rights organizations, for example, where I can remember NHMC and Color of Change and CMJ at one point being the only civil rights organizations that were pushing for Title II. We learned what arguments we had to make. We also had, at that point, there was still some hope that you could do this under Title I and somehow avoid Title II. And one of the things about the court case was that it made it very clear you can either have an open internet or you can have Title I. But you can't have an open internet without Title II. And I will say, at a very early point, when I was talking with some folks in the kind of the insider Washington thing, where they were like, okay, Google and Facebook and all of the other companies, they're tired, they don't want to fight this again, they're not sure they even want Title II. What's the strategy for getting this? And I said, what we're going to do is show Wheeler and everybody else that the only way they get what they want is to go through Title II, and that anything else will just be too painful for them to do. No matter how painful they think Title II is, not doing Title II will be more painful. And that's what made the difference.
So one of the interesting analogies, and I can't remember who said it. There are coalition calls and discussions that go on and about Chairman Wheeler was that, what our organizing goal was to kind of put him in a box. Because he did come out with early proposals that nobody liked. The paid prioritization plan that was released in February, the hybrid proposal, and we kept on putting him in a box. We built walls around him, and I think he reached a point. This, Gigi probably would disagree with me, but we reached a point where it seemed like he kind of liked the parameters of that box. He said, "This box is all right. I think I'll set up shop here and make it my home." That's obviously an activist side analysis, but it's one that I like to use. Thanks, Harold. Sarah, I'm wondering, you've been in this fight for a while as well, and in your experiences and your visits to the FCC, was there a moment for you where you felt, in reference to some of the other commissioners, I know there was a struggle to make sure that Commissioner Rosenn and Clyburn were supportive of this. What was your sense of those interactions? I don't want you to betray any confidences, of course, but what was your sense of how the FCC, how the climate changed there on this issue as well?
Well, what's interesting is I think the FCC always wanted to get it right. I don't think anyone went into this with bad intentions, and I think that what we saw was the product of both political pressure pushing them in different directions and a genuine shifting in thinking at the FCC. It's interesting, I think that the moments, just speaking candidly as someone who was inside the halls, the moments where I think we were making the most progress were the ones that felt toughest. And I think someone mentioned a sort of stiffening as we got towards certain, we hit these certain thresholds in the debate. And as an advocate, it was tough at times because it felt like we were, screwing up or something. But then each time we moved the ball forward, and each time I think that realization that this was the right path, and as you said, getting comfortable in the end, the box at the end game started to happen, and it was incredibly powerful. It was to really feel like there was that buy-in, and that to really be in pushing that, I think was a really rewarding, if not at times very challenging experience.
Great, thank you. We're gonna sub in new. We've got a break here, and I wanted to take a moment to ask Joe Torres to join us. Joe Torres is with Free Press. Does a lot of our government relations work. You may have heard his name. This is the man. Joe, I think Rashad touched on this pretty well earlier. I know that you were very instrumental in orchestrating a lot of the work on the Hill and at the FCC in trying to change the narrative amongst members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, and who had, in earlier fights, not been with us on this. And I'm wondering if you could, you could tell that story a little bit and how that transition occurred and what that's, what the struggle's like. It's still ongoing, I understand, and talk a little bit to that.
First of all, it's snowing outside. Just noticed that. In 2010, 74 Democrats came out against Title II. The majority of the House were against Title II. The entire Republican caucus, practically everyone, I think maybe except one, but all of them basically. And 74 Democrats. They were made up of Blue Dogs, CBC members, and CHC, Congressional Black Caucus and Hispanic Caucus members. Now the Blue Dogs got wiped out. They got wiped out a few years ago. And so for the telecom companies, the CBC and the CHC, as well as civil rights groups, are part of their base of support. It's been part of their base. And in DC, there's really very, how should we say, folks are not very well equipped to deal with this, right? It's tough for folks to say the CBC and the CHC and the civil rights groups are, not doing the right thing, right? So when those Blue Dogs left, in this time around, they were going to rely on CBC and CHC in order to have bipartisan opposition to the FCC rules. We've been working on this for years. It's been one of my great honors, actually, to work with Color of Change and Center for Media Justice, the National Hispanic Media Coalition. We have more than 100 racial justice and civil rights groups in support of net neutrality now, right? We brought Center for Media Justice, brought one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, and activists from Ferguson. And the activist from Ferguson, in one funny story, he told one congressional office who said they want to support net neutrality, he says, so what does that mean? Now, Title I, from how I understand it, means you're for an open internet, but for an open internet for the rich. Title II means you're open internet for everyone. Which one are you for? And then he met with his congressional representative and said, don't tell me something out here and here. I'm not a politician, and say something out there, right? So through the years, we fought with these, we continue to butt heads with these groups and congressional representatives on a Comcast NBC merger, on the AT&T T-Mobile merger. We've been working at this for a long time. And so for this time around, one of the things that we decided to do was to ask Keith Ellison and the Progressive Caucus and Rahul Grahava to lead a letter in support of Title II. We knew a couple things. We knew that this is not 2010 anymore. The fact that, what gave me hope actually is that the court decision itself gave me hope, because the court decision made it clear, as Harold was saying, there's one way to go. And then two, we got 1 million petitions in 2 weeks after the court case. That showed that something out there was happening, that people understood this fundamentally, how important this issue was fundamentally to their life in a way they haven't before. So we got Grahava and Ellison to lead a letter back in May, and we got 37, 38, something like that, members on. What that did was to also ice the CBC and CHC from being against Title II. So they tried to do another letter, and they only had 19. You should have been 20, but Joaquin Castro got his name off the letter after he felt some heat. So, and his numbers has remained stagnant since then in opposition too. The threat is still real. The companies are not giving up. There are some civil rights groups already saying that this was overreach and they want congressional legislation. I think they have to hashtag net law now or something like that, right? So what Rashad was saying before, I echo that this is the kind of work that may not receive the attention, but we could have very easily been have faced leading up to the FCC decision, truly bipartisan legislation with CBC and CHC members on board with Thune and Upton against net neutrality. And that would have been a really bad scenario, So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Joe. There's a long, great story there that at some point, I think Joe might write it. Would be nice. Margaret, there's been since this decision, there's been a pretty incredible pushback from our friends on the right. If you follow the net neutrality hashtag on Twitter, which used to be pretty uniformly for net neutrality, you look at it today, you'll see a lot of anti-net neutrality language in there, language being the euphemism. And is there, are we losing ground here? Is there a grassroots movement amongst the anti-net neutrality community that needs to be confronted? And if so, how do we do that?
Right. So I think this is really to be expected. It's not surprising to me at all, and I don't think that they have a movement. We know the majority of people on, throughout the political spectrum are supportive of net neutrality. So this is like their desperate move to try to, make it look like it isn't. I think that when we look at successful social movements, they have 8 stages, and the 7th stage is victory. The 8th stage is defending that victory. And so that's where we are now. The 8th stage is defending and then moving on to the next battle. And basically our work is never done. So I think that we need to continue. We've shown that there's a strong movement. We need to continue doing what we've been doing. I think Free Press is doing fantastic work of putting out papers dispelling the myths. And that's what we need to keep doing, is getting out there and just calling out the lies and continuing to shine a light on the truth and to be willing to fight for what we need to do.
And Harold, you have seen FCC commissioners come and go. There are 2.
Old.
Well, no, I think I'm older than you, Harold. There are 2 very outspoken commissioners right now against this order, Commissioner Ajit Pai and Mike O'Reilly, and Pai especially. In your time, have you seen that level of dissent at the commission? I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing, but can you explain a little bit about what you think they're doing and particularly what Ajit Pai's objectives are here?
Yeah, I have to say, I have never seen anything like this, particularly from just what Ajit Pai has been doing is destructive of the institution. It is, for a very long time, the FCC has had contentious issues. I'm not going to pretend that the FCC was a little island of bipartisan cooperation in the sea of hyper-partisan dysfunction that is Washington, but I cannot ever imagine, Michael Copps or Jonathan Adelstein accusing Michael Powell of throwing the media ownership thing as a favor to his daddy in order to sell the Iraq war, which is the kind of accusations that Pai has been making about the Obama plan and all these insinuations which come out of, and it has been the worst sort of middle school bullying. Particularly if you followed Ajit Pai's career, starting with, Verizon, and since he has gotten to the FCC, he has been a loyal vote for Verizon and AT&T every time. But going through, just the litany of ways in which Pai in particular has hyper-partisanized this, I've chronicled a bunch of these on my blog, so I can come back with me to the news survey that was killed as the effort to create the fairness doctrine, or when Pai was trying to browbeat the staff in the Wireless Bureau because there was a broad consensus that just happened to exclude consumers on the incentive stuff, but AT&T and Verizon and NAB, according to Pai, make a consensus and et cetera. What's going on here, has just been unbelievable. And it is clearly an effort to delay while creating I will accuse you of a conspiracy, of delaying to show this order while making it impossible for you to get the order out. I will attempt to force procedural errors by writing endless dissents back and forth. I will tell bluntly outright lies about how the FCC process works, and they'll be, what, me? Any other commissioner would have fired a chief of staff who compared the chair of the FCC to a dog. But Pi has let his dogs loose on Twitter to create the kind of barking that is typical of the conservative noise machine. And ultimately, I think this is sadly self-destructive. I think that to the extent that the Republican leadership would like to do a deal, reach out to the centrist Democrats and the others who have traditionally been supportive. I may thank Pi for poisoning the water so much that it becomes politically impossible for Democrats, to cut a deal in Congress, to cut a deal on this. When they say Obamacare for the internet, we may actually be grateful because it turns out to be it's a hyper-partisan thing that works so well that even Republicans can't attack it in the end. But that's pretty much what's going on, and I think that it has just been atrocious, outrageous, and ultimately damaging to the institution, and it should be recognized for what it is, a deliberate attempt to force procedural errors, create conspiracy theories, and fight for the ground in the next battle, because what this is all about is exactly about the Republican, traditional playbook of, act like middle school bullies, frighten everybody else from trying to defend this, and win the argument just by creating this whole cloud around it of sort of bad action conspiracy stuff. So we need to come in strong. If we're going to have an FCC that has the willingness to enforce net neutrality, we need to defend it in Congress and melt down that switchboard every time they hold a dumbass hearing like they're going to hold on tomorrow. So.
Great. Well, we're at that turning point again. Margaret, I think you're thank you very much, Margaret Powers, everyone. I'd like to invite David Segal up from Demand Progress. David started Demand Progress with Aaron Schwartz and has been very active on a lot of the issues that we care a lot about. David has, I think, a really sage ability, I think as a former politician perhaps, to understand what gets politicians thinking and moving on issues. And his strategic advice in a lot of the work that we've done has been really instrumental. And I asked the question of Evan earlier about the PIPA and SOPA battle, and I know that you and Aaron were really deeply involved in that work. And so I kind of want to ask that of you again, comparing that battle to this one. How do you think the political climate has changed around what we're calling this sort of internet community and our political power?
So let me start by saying something that I'm a little bit reluctant to bring up, but I think somebody needs to. This was an extraordinary win, incredibly important win, particularly because it keeps open channels that we hope will enable future wins. But it doesn't augment the fact that we live now and live during the SOPA era in a plutocracy. And this is what we're up against all of the time. There's certain reasons why this fight was winnable, and I'm trying to figure out how to help people be excited about this win without doing anything to create a notion that activism is going to be easy moving forward. And this is, I worry that this is an exception that proves the rule in many respects. So sorry to be a bring down,
Sure,
some of my, but I think it needs to be spoken. These were both fights in which there was a bit of a split among the plutocrats, which made them more winnable, though I think that split was more evident, was sharper in the SOPA context than in the net neutrality context, which does make this win more sweet, as others have spoken to. I think that an essential similarity is that these are both issues of internet policy, and one can particularly use the internet to organize relative to issues that relate to the internet. Because you can, in these moments, do things like create the widgets that enable the distributed organizing and also have an incentive for websites like a Tumblr, like a Reddit, to make use of those widgets because success in these fights impacts them very deeply, impacts their users. You also have this extraordinary phenomenon that I don't know where else it's ever happened in the history of humankind, where the harm that people learn about the harm that they will suffer if we don't win the fight on the platform that they then use in order to communicate to the powers that be that they ought to side with the people in that fight. And you can really only do that around internet organizing, around an issue like SOPA or net neutrality or hopefully surveillance. We've been able to do to some degree. Hopefully we'll be able to make that organizing more robust moving forward. But unfortunately, a lot of those things are not generalizable to activism at large.
So speaking of activism, there was an event that occurred in Philadelphia on Friday, I believe it was, involving a banner and an airplane. And I know that you were very involved in that. And I want you to just tell folks a little bit about the planning around that and what happened.
But I'm also I'm going to start by telling a separate story first, if that's okay. Which is there was on Thursday, there was also a pretty extraordinary event.
Yes, of course.
That happened in Philadelphia that hasn't gotten as much
that's right, of course.
national attention as it ought, and it was organized by Penn students. It should surprise nobody here that David Cohen, who's the chief lobbyist for Comcast, which is based in Philadelphia, also happens to be the chair of the board of trustees at the University of Pennsylvania, because this is the world that we live in. And they happened to have their annual meeting on the morning of the FCC vote, essentially concurrent with that vote. And a number of Penn students, a couple of dozen of them, went to that meeting to demand that David Cohen stop working in the disinterest of Penn students and people who care about academic freedom everywhere, and people who care about the internet everywhere, and took the meeting and realized when they got into the room that, of course, he wasn't there because he was, we think, dealing with the fallout from the FCC vote that was happening in the same moments. And they did an extraordinary job and got to ask the question of why this man who purports to be working in the best interests of the school not only supports an issue that's contrary to the will of most students, but also isn't even able to show up to an annual meeting that he's supposed to be in charge of. And that's gotten some press in Philadelphia, and it will play out, I think, over weeks to come. We're hoping that somebody will actually investigate the story of where the hell he was in that moment, because it's still not come out. But then the next day, several organizations, your organization and Fight for the Future, and we flew a banner crowdfunded by hundreds of internet activists and people who are involved in this fight otherwise around the Comcast tower in downtown Philly that had Grumpy Cat, an important internet meme, scowling out at the building and demanding that Comcast cease messing with the internet. And it was a little bit of a twisting of the knife, but also a demonstration that we understand where the problem lies. Like we understand that this is we live under corporatist governance, and we understand that this fight would not have been a hard fight were it not for the extraordinary power that corporations like Comcast have over our media infrastructure and our political infrastructure, and it's important to name that again and again.
Thanks. Joe and I have worked together for a long time on this issue of media consolidation, which mostly was a fight that was fought at the FCC around issues of broadcast ownership. We're seeing a similar frame in the internet space, but it's sort of the other side of consolidation. It's decentralization. There have been a lot of people saying that the new media needs to remain decentralized, and I know you've fought both of those battles, and I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I view this, folks, maybe they're doing less and less now, but they divide old media and new media. It's all media to me, right? The fight over who controls the media is a fight that's been happening since the post office was created and the distribution of newspapers and how newspapers get subsidized. For me, why this fight is so critical is because whenever technology comes around, a new technology comes along, it creates a new media industry. And there's always that critical moment when the government has to decide, does it regulate each new industry to allow the greatest number of voices to participate, or does it turn over control to the hands of a few? Now, radio is very similar to the fight over the internet because it was radio hobbyists who developed what radio could potentially be. And before the corporations understood the commercial value and swooped in, and the government in 1927 gave the power to NBC and CBS. For me, maybe I'm wrong, but to me this is one of the few times where in 2005, when Harold said the Brand X case, I think there was about 30% of the country had broadband adoption, had broadband. And now it's 75. And so those other fights, people really didn't have the technology, didn't have the media didn't own radio sets, or very few cable subscribers when those decisions were being made. This decision is a historical decision because this decision is coming at a critical juncture. What's the internet going to be? Is it going to be for the masses or for the privileged few? but 75% of the people already had an expectation of what the internet should be. And for me, it is a racial justice, social justice issue at its core, right? I mean, how do we fight for any social good if we can't have the ability to tell our own voice? I mean, in this city, in New York City, in 1827 was the first African-American newspaper, Freedom's Journal. And I say this all the time, but in the first edition of the paper, they said, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. From the press and the pulpit, we have suffered much from being incorrectly represented." I think we're still fighting for that today. And so for the fact that the 3/4 of U.S. household had broadband, I think made a difference because there was an expectation. Folks fighting for Black Lives Matter, folks fighting the undocumented immigrants fighting for their rights against an unjust immigration system, so forth and so on. There was an expectation of what the internet should be. And so I think this issue of decentralization is a real victory, I think, in the history of media policy and policy making, that we don't win this fight too often. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Joe. So we've been together for 80 minutes, and I'm gonna tap myself out and open the floor to questions from you, because basically I've run out of them. So we'll start back here, and we also have other participants in the front row here, so all of you should feel free to answer. Yes. Let's get a mic to the. You want to use this one? Okay, I'll get it to him.
Run like a. What is it? A Phil Donahue. Run like Phil Donahue. So.
Thank you. I'm Alfredo from May 1st People Inc. We're members of the Media Action Grassroots Network, along with the Media Mobilizing Project with my sister Hannah. And we work extensively with Joe and the Free Press people, just so you know. When people start talking like they just say Malkia Cyril, that's what she actually means. She means magnet, you know. That we were part of that campaign. The one thing I want to say about this is that I don't think we've paid enough attention to the issue of cell phones and the fundamental difference that exists between 2010 and 2015 was the massification of the use of cell phones by people of color. It is now the principal technology communications device. Now, this campaign that we're talking about was driven by a lot of people of color from the start. And when as the usage of cell phones became clear, that's where Title I and Title II comes in. So when they jumped on the Title II, that means that's the protection that telephony has. Then you saw an enormous reaction. We could see it here in New York among people of color who became very, very interested in the issue. We asked before how you bring people of color in here. Well, I mean, on this issue, people of color are already in. But one of the ways you do it is to talk about stuff that makes a difference to our lives. Because net neutrality is fundamental if we use cell phones. And cell phones are fundamental to the communications of people of color in this country. So, send it. Thank you.
All right.
I just want to add one thing about this, which I hope people will use going forward on this, which is one of the more important common carrier cases going back to, I think it was the late 50s, involved Bull Connor and his attempt to disconnect the local NAACP chapter president from his phone service, and he basically went to the local bell company and said, "I want you to cut this guy off because, you know, he's a no good Negro guy, probably a bookie or something, and, you know, just cut off his phone service." And what happened was they went to court, and the court said, no, you can't just cut off this person's phone service because this is a common carrier service. It's regulated as a basic essential service that everyone is entitled to, and you can't just be arbitrarily cut off. That is why this stuff is so critically important. It all goes back to the phone stuff. You know, well, we just can't stress that enough, I think.
Hi, Dave Burstein. I write about some of this, and I'm pretty geeky. I've spent the last week working on LAA, which I bet very few people in this room know, but it's going to be the next war coming up soon. It's the biggest story at MWC in Barcelona, where the whole mobile world is. They want to take some of the Wi-Fi spectrum for the phone companies. That's what this is about. That's why it's going to be a war. So the question I want to throw out at you guys is this going to be on the Washington radar soon? Or how do we get it there? Because I already got the engineers talking about it.
And that's a question for all 10 of our panelists. I'm not familiar with it, so I welcome someone else's comment.
Somebody other than me. Okay. A bunch of us have been pushing on it. It is actually an issue, but it brings up another one of these areas that, Milo touched on a little bit about some of the possibilities, and some of the others have, that I want to raise, that open spectrum is another one of these critically important things. We think of it as Wi-Fi. It is, I know, one of those crazy things that, makes people's eyes glaze over mostly. But one of the ways the opposition tends to win is by characterizing this stuff as all technical, which is one of the things they've tried to do on net neutrality, is make it, oh, you guys don't understand about prioritization and CDNs and all of that. And the issues were not technical, as Tim Wu was talking about earlier. They were about fundamental values. There's a fundamental value here that I hope people here will come away with and understand, that the public airwaves can actually be accessed by the public, and that should be a fundamental right, that what is ours, what belongs to everyone, should not be privatized and constrained and confined for the benefit of the handful of large companies who have made billions of dollars on it. So I certainly hope that as we move forward on this, that we will see, again, people understanding that, yeah, this stuff is out here right now for everybody, but it won't be unless we defend it.
While Tim Donahue's to the next person, I'll say one more thing too, which is with winning on this particular fight and this time, we've gotten a little bit of, yeah, but what you really should have been doing is, and I'm like, okay, this stuff is fundamental, so of course there are other things to do. You've heard Rashad talk about it, you've heard Kevin and Margaret talk about it, lots of people. There's lots more to do. Nobody is saying we're done or this is the only thing. It has been an all-consuming fight in some ways, but there's only so many of us in this room who work on these things. We're hoping to grow that and, of course, hit everything out of the park as much as we can.
All right. Jeremy Pesner. So there's been a big call here, in the wake of this victory. A lot of people are saying, we have more to do, get involved. And I'd like to get down to brass tacks about exactly how to do that. Now, if you work for an advocacy organization, that's easy. It's your job. You're in that fight every day. Okay. But this question is about the rest of us. Calling a congressman or an agency is relatively easy. That's not usually a big deal to do. But beyond that, I have other questions. Some of us are in positions where we can't, or it's not a good idea to alienate certain people and organizations that are working in this space. And it just sort of becomes a question of how we can really contribute without risking, jail or lawsuits or worse, expatriation. So I want to talk about other ways that we can be involved. What role do policy conferences play in these? What role do academic studies play in these? What other forms of being involved? How exactly do we get involved? And what kind of spectrum does that really cover?
All right, we've got about 2.5 minutes, and I got one more question.
I just said there's a lot of ways to contribute. One of the things, this is a continuing education process. I mean, we have to continue to talk. I don't know what networks you belong to, whatever, like networks I belong to. I go to the boards, I talk to the boards, I educate folks on why this is their fight. That's what Rashad and I have been doing for years. We get 100 racial justice, civil rights groups. We constantly talk to people why their organization needs to be involved. And it takes time, relationship building. So it doesn't come overnight. So that's my quick answer, since I'll not pass the mic. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually don't want to answer the question. I just want to announce that we just got word that Fast Track, which was supposed to be introduced last week, then supposed to be introduced this week, is not going to be introduced until sometime in April. So we're winning every step of the way. So let's keep fighting.
Rashad, you have
a quick question.
we have time?
I want to just answer the question too. What you've seen today, right here in this session, you've seen some people who have been sleeping on the street and blockading Tom Wheeler's car. You've seen people who are studying the law. You've seen people who are organizing Twitter and email campaigns. You've seen people who are organizing people of color and civil rights movements behind network neutrality. You've seen people who are organizing the business community. You've seen people who are doing an entire spectrum of things. And for you to say, what can I do? Well, choose one. Choose three. We're all here. That's what this session is about. Thank you. Micha, come on.
Bring it home.
Actually, it's an anticlimactic question. I was hoping maybe Evan was still here. Oh, okay. Well, someone else maybe can answer. Just because it's a very techy group here, what would you say best tools, most innovative in terms of the kinds of things that are done to mobilize people? What would you highlight?
I think the distributed widgets are incredibly important. They work on these issues. It will not work on all issues. They work on issues where internet platforms have something at stake. So we ask websites to put up tools that their users can then utilize to call Congress, to email the FCC, whatever the question might be. But some of the stuff is just simpler than that. It's unfortunately the case that there's a lot of writing out there, a lot of criticism of clicktivism, of slacktivism, and there are all sorts of ways in which these tactics can be made more effective or less effective. One basic one is, if you're asking people to sign a petition or email Congress, actually deliver the petitions or the emails, ideally do them in real time, ideally deliver them as emails that come from a unique constituent, because that's an actual demonstration of power, and it becomes clear to the people on the receiving end that there was a real person on the other end of that exchange. We've done a ton of encouragement of people to make phone calls. At some point we got saturated. We'd saturated all of the relevant channels with emails and petitions, and phone calls is incredibly esoteric. They're costly for an organization like ours to encourage because you don't achieve new signups to your list when you ask people to make phone calls. People will unsubscribe. A very small number of people will make the phone calls. So one thing I would say to the person in the back who was asking about how to engage, like, make those phone calls when you're asked to, if you're able to, because they are incredibly powerful. They're probably worth as much as 100 emails. Very few people actually decide to engage with that particular, engage their offices in that particular fashion, and you can just completely undermine a congressional office's ability to get any work done for the course of a day with a couple hundred phone calls coming in that clearly demonstrate that there's a real power, real energy behind the cause that's generating them. So I'm happy to talk more later about this stuff. But
So call your member of Congress. That's it. We're at 90 minutes. Thank you.
All of our panelists.
Everybody stand up. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.